Hi, I'm Oliver Burton, and my presentation is about finding appealing catalyst for nanomaterial growth, specifically holistic catalyst design. That is, designing the catalyst by optimizing an entire process tree rather than just any one characteristic. So in this presentation, I'm going to go through or rather why the catalyst is important, what is the best orientation of copper for graphene growth, and how can we make it? So, is the catalyst important? Yes, that's kind of the point of this presentation, but why is it important? I come from the sort of general field of 2D material synthesis. My work was largely focused on making well-defined crystalline materials over large areas. And we've known that for some time there's an epitaxial relationship between the catalyst and the 2D material orientation when it's grown through chemical vapor deposition. We broadly have two situations then. Either the graphene grows aligned in one particular orientation, or it doesn't, and we end up with grain boundaries. Copper 111 is an example that grows epitaxially aligned graphene, and it gives us a potential route to sort of large-scale single crystal 2D films over large areas. Broadly speaking, there are two different routes to producing single crystals in the literature. We can either sort of recrystallize a foil into a large single crystal through some grain growth mechanism, or we can use an epitaxial substrate and target a particular orientation and grow a thin film of it. So first of all, I'll talk about why I don't use foils, or why I'm not using foils in this particular study. And whilst you can recrystallize them, and there's a lot of literature on this, my previous work shown that there's a lot of problems associated with them. As the title suggests, they're dirty, they're also rough. White light interferometry shows height variations on the order of microns, and secondary ion mass spectrometry shows heavy carbon contamination on the commercially available foils. And this manufacturing process that is used to create these foils basically prints the carbon into the rolling lines. And these rolling lines then, with their increased carbon content, preferentially nucleates graphene, and it makes it very difficult to control the nucleation density itself. We can anneal in hydrogen as an additional sort of process step and study the effects, but systematic study shows that carbon in the bulk is still responsible for unwanted multilayers. And whilst you can remove it procedurally, it's much easier at this point to actually think about creating your own ideal catalyst for creating these 2D materials. So now we're going to talk about finding appealing catalysts, finding this ideal catalyst. What properties do we want? And this is what we care about. We want the graphene to be able to be used, we want it to be applied to some substrate, so it needs to be transferable. More importantly, or equally importantly, once we have transfer, we want it to be clean. So we actually need that transfer to be dry, reflecting these exfoliated graphene samples that have very high quality, very clean interfaces. And finally, we want the graphene to actually be of good quality. We don't care that we can get it from A to B, or that it grows and is very high quality on a particular substrate. We want it to be high quality when we transfer it. So we need it to be grown on a flat substrate, we need the transfer to be quite a high yield, we ideally would like it to be single crystal or epitaxial aligned, and we want some metric for quality post-transfer. So this is sort of an overview of the study. You can see here a little cartoon image of a copper tile overlaid with an EBSD map over the scale of about 1 centimeter. And this reflects sort of the hundreds of different crystallographic orientations of copper we use on a single copper tile, basically as individual sort of micro studies. Each crystallographic orientation of copper acts as its own individual set of experiments through which we can grow individual graphene domains, etch individual holes to assess the orientation, do spectroscopic and optical mapping, as well as SEM mapping to ascertain all sorts of different properties of the graphene that we can use to judge what is the best crystallographic orientation. And there's a little bit of a explanation as to what we actually do, how we actually transfer that graphene off the tile. We humidify it in a particular environment at around 30 degrees for a few days so that the copper at the interface with the graphene oxidizes. This oxide then typically decouples the graphene so that we can use a PVA PDMS stamp on the PVA, allow it to set, peel it off, and then apply this to a substrate of choice. In this case, we use silicon dioxide on silicon because it's typically used in electronic devices. And then we can rinse off the PVA with a DI water soak, and we're left with our graphene on silicon dioxide on silicon. And as a little bit of a summary and a little bit of a spoiler, we can draw up these crystallographic maps for each part of the process, looking at these sort of spatially mapped and correlated studies that tell us, as a function of crystallographic orientation of the catalyst, what are the particular properties of the graphene. For example, the number of orientations of graphene present on each catalyst, how much of it is transferred, what is the D to G ratio as measured by Raman spectroscopy. So we'll start out talking about the graphene oxidation, or the interfacial oxidation of the copper beneath the graphene. On the top right here, you can see a rough schematic of the cell we use. It's basically a hot plate with some water, the sample elevated above with a cover to stop water condensing on it so it doesn't mess with the experiment. We found this to give a consistent and repeatable oxidation at the interface. So what does the oxidation actually do? Before oxidation, you can see these crosses here with the color corresponding to this IPF color map. So blue, for example, is 111, red is 100, and green is 110, as a lot of you might be familiar with. These crosses correspond to the graphene regions measured on those crystallographic orientations by Raman before oxidation, whereas the circles represent those same orientations after oxidation. And you can see a very clear trend here. The graphene prior to oxidation is quite strained to varying degrees, but after oxidation it relaxes to a strain of around 0 if these empirical Raman measurements are accurate. And there's a little bit of debate on that, but in general you can see the trend of a relaxing strain. And this is representative of effectively the graphene decoupling from the copper substrate. Moving on towards thinking about how it actually transfers, we can map Tg, and this is the percentage or the fractional value of that graphene that's successfully transferred from that which is grown. So we take each one of these individual islands, we measure where they are, and then we transfer them and measure in the SEM how much of that graphene is actually transferred. And we can compare with the oxide measurements from optical microscopy and the transferred measurements from SEM to see what sort of trends exist. And you can see a reasonably unsurprising trend that the more the interface is oxidized, the more transfer we get. But it's not necessarily so clear. The results are a correlation, but they're not particularly a great one. And you can see, for example, these 3 points down here, very heavily oxidized, but very little is transferred. And if you take a look to the right in the next plot, you can have a look and see why or what's going on here. And these points are all blue. They all tend towards 111. So in 111, it follows a slightly different trend, for example, 100, which shows reasonably linear, that the more you oxidize, the more you get off. And we can have a bit of a deeper dig and look at something called oxide inhomogeneity that we've defined as the standard deviation of the oxide as measured by optical microscopy. And you can see effectively the rougher the oxide, the less is transferred per average oxidation value. And what that means is, for example, on copper 111, there are some regions that are very heavily oxidized, and we find this particularly at the edges, as you can sort of see in this non-copper 111 image. But in the central regions and intermittently, there's lots of regions that don't have any oxide whatsoever. So the standard deviation is very high. And as a result, some areas get transferred, but the vast majority doesn't. And this oxide inhomogeneity is sort of a metric that allows us to quantify what's going on in all of these hundreds of different orientations. Once we've transferred the graphene, which you can see here in the SEM, we can have a little look at how it performs in terms of quality. And we use Raman D to G ratio, that is the intensity of the D peak as a ratio to the intensity of the G peak, and use this as a sort of analog for quality. It's not ideal, it's not perfect, but it is fast, and it's something we can apply to hundreds of different orientations in one study. And you can see here, if you zoom in, whilst the majority of graphene in this particular sample has been transferred, the Raman shows a little bit of a different story, with lots of regions having a higher D to G peak. And these reflect regions that aren't necessarily visible in optical or SEM microscopy, but tears, folds, wrinkles, etc., things that are deleterious to the quality as measured of the graphene. So the next thing to look at is the epitaxial alignment of the graphene itself on each crystallographic orientation of copper. To measure this, We grow graphene and etch tiny little hexagonal holes with a hydrogen annealing process after growth. And these holes locally reveal the orientation of the graphene locally. They basically track the zigzag or armchair edges. So we can analyze, in this case, over 500,000 or nearly 500,000 holes in the copper tile, in the graphene on the copper tile, repeat this process a couple of times, and find out how many different orientations of graphene are on each crystallographic orientation of copper. Long story short, there are many different crystallographic orientations of copper that result in epitaxial alignment like 1-1-1. You can see here I've highlighted a particular orientation that, as we'll see later, is quite interesting. On the right-hand side, you can just see some of the raw results just for your information. You can see that the different experiments line up very neatly. So this turns out to be a very rapid and repeatable method of finding out how many orientations of graphene are present on each crystallographic orientation of copper. So finally, as I mentioned, we transfer the graphene onto a substrate as sort of a mock application. And then we can do Raman spectroscopy. And we can do this on each of the different graphene islands, on each of the different crystallographic orientations of copper. And we can draw up a map of the average quality, the average D/G ratio of the graphene as a function of crystallographic orientation. And you can see here that 1-1-1 is actually mediocre. Once transferred, because of all of these issues in transfer with the inhomogeneous oxide, you end up with actually quite a poor quality film in this particular process. 1-0-0, very high quality, very low D/G ratio, but unfortunately there's multiple orientations of graphene, so we're going to end up with high angle grain boundaries. Again, in this central region, not highlighted here, you'll notice that there is another low, where the graphene, whilst not being any of the low index crystallographic orientations of copper, does have a very low D/G ratio. So we can combine all of this. We've got all the fast descriptors we need. We can see if the graphene is epitaxially aligned in just one orientation. We can see how well it transfers as a percentage of the graphene that should be there. And we can look at its post-transfer quality using D/G as a sort of analog. And we overlay this information, it gives us a mask. And that bright region that I alluded to area gives the best-in-class characteristics across all three of these metrics. It's epitaxially aligned, has a low D/G ratio after transfer, and transfers to a very high proportion of the graphene that should be there. And that's around 168, 169 crystal orientation. Great, so we know what crystallographic orientation of copper is best, but how do we get it? This takes us towards making our own catalyst. As I alluded to earlier, we're going to be using thin films rather than foils due to roughness constraints. And one of the problems with thin films is when you take too thin a film to too high a temperature, they de-wet. And this leads to poor quality growth of 2D materials, as well as roughening of the surface and poor transfer just because of an inhomogeneous and incomplete catalyst. So we find that we need quite thick films, between 5 to 10 microns in fact of copper, to prevent de-wetting at 1065 degrees Celsius. We've previously found that atmospheric contamination of the catalyst just being left in air can affect the growth conditions, so ideally we'd actually like to do this within the CVD reactor itself. In order to do this, we effectively create an evaporative system where we have our source copper and our target substrate at the top, and we reduce the distance between them, significantly increasing the amount of flux captured by that substrate. And then to mitigate partially the uneven deposition distribution that we'd expect from doing this, we swap our point source molten blob and extend the plane into a large 2D solid foil. So we, instead of relying on evaporation, rely on sublimation. And this works for very high vapor pressure metals such as copper, and also silver, and gold can even be used despite its quite low vapor pressure. And you can see here, in the case of sapphire, you expect twinning in copper. But when we do EBSD mapping at different sections of time after we start the deposition, you can see something happening. You end up with islands of these two different orientations, just in plane rotated. And it moves from a set of individual islands to a continuous film. And then something interesting happens. One of the twins starts to reduce its proportion. And this is probably due to slight offcuts in the sapphire preferentiating one orientation over the other. But the net effect is you end up, after around 60 minutes, with a over 10 micron thick single crystal copper film. And we can characterize the quality of the copper film using all the usual methods, EBSD, XRD, and AFM. And we can see that the film is, for every location we've looked, and this is on the order of sort of centimeter scale sample sizes, that it is a single crystal with one orientation, and that the roughness is around 2 nanometers. So it's a very good quality film. So as we mentioned earlier, 111 isn't actually the ideal orientation for graphene growth and transfer. So we can extend the technique using different cuts of single crystal magnesium oxide and deposit whatever orientation we want. And this actually works for different metals. We've tested it with copper, silver, gold, nickel it seems to work on with early results, although the sublimation rate is very low. So now we can combine this with the work I showed earlier. We can produce a single crystal orientation of copper exactly where we need it at 168, 169. We can grow graphene on it, graphene islands in this case, just so that we can assess different properties. We can characterize those graphene islands, show that they are representative of the study we did. And then we can do things that exfoliated graphene studies do. We can take HBN, peel off this graphene from the copper surface itself, and this results in a nice clean interface where we can make Hall bar devices, for example, and we can assess the quality of the graphene in terms of mobility, and we show that it's over 40,000 centimeters squared per volt second, and it indicates that the quality is on par with those of state-of-the-art exfoliated graphene samples. So to summarize, we spatially map and correlate multiple different metrics from multiple different techniques: EBSD, optical microscopy, SEM, rotating compensatory ellipsometry, although I haven't gone into much in the presentation, as well as Raman spectroscopy for different islands and different orientations. We overlay these different metrics, which are all functions themselves of the crystallographic orientation that the graphene is grown on, to create a mask. This mask is then used to find the ideal copper orientation for this transfer process. We then use close space sublimation, or CSS as we call it, to epitaxially grow a high quality single crystal film of copper. We then grow graphene on this, interfacially oxidize, and implement it into some basic devices to show that it works. So this study was a result of the Hoffman Group and RWTH Aachen University. So it's a cross-Cambridge Aachen collaboration, specifically with the Stanford Group, who have been instrumental in helping with the devices and throughout the study in terms of guidance and oxidation processes. I'd also like to thank EMP, Electronic and Photonic Nanodevices Group, EPSRC, NanoDTC, and the ERC, as well as the Oppenheimer Fellowship for funding different parts of the project at different times. Feel free to ask me any questions, and if you think of anything else, please feel free to email me at ob303@cam.ac.uk.